When I tell people that I'm a wildlife rehabilitator, people often go, oh my God, that sounds amazing. I want to do that. How do I do that? And I totally get that. It's an awesome job, but it's also one that's really, really hard to get into professionally. So here are my top 5 tips for successfully getting into the wildlife rehabilitation field. The number one thing that you can do to become a wildlife rehabilitator is to get experience. And by that, I don't necessarily mean paid experience. Most people who are wildlife rehabilitators got their start volunteering. And if they didn't get volunteer experience, they definitely interned somewhere. I don't know how many times I've been asked this question, and I tell people, if you want to do this, you have to volunteer. You have to work under somebody else. If you want to do this, get hands-on experience as soon as possible, and then people just don't do it. And that's for a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's really hard to find somebody in your area that does wildlife rehabilitation and will take volunteers or has an internship program. Volunteering is unpaid, and honestly, most wildlife rehabilitation internships are also unpaid. Or if they are paid, it's with a really small stipend. So it's not financially feasible for everybody to do, but if you can volunteer or if you can intern, definitely do as much of that as you possibly can. That hands-on experience is so crucial for a lot of reasons. First off, it shows future employers that you really care about this, that you're willing to do unpaid work. Second, you've gotten a lot of experience already. And if you can volunteer at different facilities or intern at different facilities, that looks even better. Working in different places gets you different experience, working with different species and different people who have different philosophies on things. I myself have been at 4 different facilities, and I've also worked with a number of people outside of those facilities and got to see how they did things too. From vet clinics to independent rehabbers, from wildlife hospitals, all of those people are going to be coming at wildlife rehabilitation with different skills, different attitudes, and different ways of being successful, honestly. And while I generally recommend volunteering or interning at a wildlife hospital because those places have better name recognition and usually can write you better letters of recommendation or are recognized by other people in the field, if you can only volunteer at an independent rehabber that's not a veterinary facility, you have to vet them, but that's not necessarily a bad choice. And this is why I say that. So wildlife hospitals usually have medical staff, vet techs, veterinarians. They have medical facilities. They can do surgery, x-rays, etc. It always depends on the center, but usually that's the case. So they're going to be better at taking care of patients in terms of their medical needs. However, at-home rehabbers are the ones that are doing rehabilitative care for those animals, not necessarily medical care. I've known some at-home rehabbers that have better success getting their animals from initial injury to release than some wildlife hospitals do, because wildlife hospitals tend to be more medical minded versus independent rehabbers tend to be more rehabilitative and husbandry care minded. That being said, not all centers and not all independent rehabbers are created equal, and some are sketchy and some are not good to volunteer or intern at. And I'll be doing another video later that goes over how exactly you can figure out whether or not the person that you're volunteering with or at is going to be a good fit for you and is going to get you where you want to go. Because there's a really big difference between someone who specializes in cottontails and is extremely good at taking care of baby cottontails and someone down the road who's feeding raccoons out of their bare hands because they think it's cute. And both of those people might have an equivalent experience rehabilitation license. The big takeaway here, please volunteer. Please do an internship. I know they're unpaid. I know they suck. The hours are long. But if you really want to do this, you have to show potential employers that you care enough about this, that you're willing to put up with little to no pay, really crappy hours, and going out of your way to do these experiences. Stick with it. You have to stick with it. Otherwise, it's not going to probably work. The second thing that you should do is you need to multi-class and you need to be really resourceful. And what I mean by this is this. If a rehabilitation staff member is like, hey, volunteers, we need someone to volunteer to do X thing, you should be one of the first hands that gets raised. And the thing that they might be asking you to volunteer for might not necessarily be working with animals, but this is why you should do it anyway. So they might ask you to transport an animal for them to a different facility where it can get more specialized care. They might ask, hey, can you write a social media post? Hey, can you stuff these envelopes? Hey, can you sweep the floor? Hey, can you sort the new shipment of mealworms that came and get them all set up and feed them? Whether it's education stuff, administrative stuff, phone stuff. I know nobody likes answering the phone, but if you can help out, the more you're going to learn. And this is why it's important. The more you know, the more valuable you are. And that doesn't just go for rehab, that goes for pretty much anything. You might be initially volunteering or interning because you want to get animal care experience, and you will get that. But if you're doing administrative stuff, social media stuff, education stuff, whatever they ask for, as long as you can do it and you feel like you can do it well, rehabilitators have to kind of be jack of all trades, right? So the sooner that you can get varied experience, the better for you. And this is where it helps you, because if you're applying to wildlife rehabilitation jobs, you can also list all of this other stuff that you've done at a wildlife rehabilitation center and put that on your resume. And that tells the person who's looking at your resume that not only can you do all of the animal care stuff, you can also do all this other stuff too. And again, if you're volunteering to do the things that nobody else wants to do, that shows people that you have a good work ethic and you care about all aspects of rehabilitation, not just the parts that are glamorous. A lot of people want to go in this work because it sounds cool and it seems glamorous. And sometimes it is, but oftentimes it's not. You really have to get down and do the sweaty, dirty work if you're going to reap the rewards of having that cool job. And that's why getting different skills and having a good work ethic will put you at the top of your class. Number 3, think about ethics and your personal values. And here's what I mean by this. So here's the thing about working with living creatures. You're going to have an ethical sense about how you think they should be treated. So if you're going to be working with other living beings, whether they be humans or animals, you have to think about ethics. There's a reason why both veterinary doctors and human doctors have to take an oath, right? Different people have different philosophies about wildlife rehabilitation. So for instance, especially in rehabilitation, kind of the big ethical question is how you feel about euthanasia. And that encompasses a lot of things. It's when you euthanize animals, how you euthanize animals, should you euthanize those animals, and what those parameters are. Some of those rules are dictated by law. So for instance, invasive species in some states cannot be rehabilitated at all, and the only thing that a wildlife rehabilitation center is allowed to do is euthanize them. And you don't have to have a clear idea on what you're okay with and what you're not right away. But it was one of the questions that I asked pretty much all of the interns that worked for me, was straight up, how do you feel about death? And when I asked that question, I got a diversity of answers. I flat out told them oftentimes there was no right or wrong answer. I just wanted to see how they thought about things, to see whether or not I thought rehabilitation was a good fit for them. And that's also a question for whatever center that you volunteer, intern, or end up working at. What do they value in terms of the well-being of those animals? And I know when people hear the term euthanasia, a lot of people go like this because they're like, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to hear about euthanasia. It's a dirty word. But euthanasia actually means good death. Yes, you want to save animals, but you also want to give those animals that aren't going to make it a good death. And that means euthanizing them when it's appropriate, whatever that means depending on the case. But that's also something that varies depending on what center you're at. So for instance, I know of someone who knew of a facility that flat out didn't believe in euthanasia. They believed that animals were either going to survive or they were going to die on their own. And I know that on paper, for some of you, that might seem like it's a good thing, especially because there's no-kill shelters, right? If there's no-kill shelters for domestic animals, why shouldn't there be a no-kill shelter for wildlife? But the problem with that is wildlife that's coming into rehabilitation usually is not healthy to begin with. And personally speaking, I think euthanasia is 100% warranted, even if you're really anti-euthanasia. For instance, I've seen animals that have 100% fatal conditions. They will never get better. They will never be able to walk. They will never be able to stand. They will never be able to take care of themselves. And it's stressful for them to be like that. And again, these are wild animals. They aren't like cats and dogs. And for me personally, if the choice is I can let this animal live, but it's going to be crawling around in its own filth, it's going to be stressed out, it's not going to be happy, even if it can barely feed itself, is that really ethical to keep that animal in that condition? Or maybe it's kinder to give it a sooner death, one where it's not having to suffer, it's not having to be stressed out all the time. If that animal is never going to be able to recover, if it's not a good candidate to be an education animal, personally, I think that euthanasia is an okay thing sometimes. And in rehab, it's often really necessary. The majority of animals that come into rehab don't make it. Sometimes euthanasia is just necessary, and if you're not comfortable with it, you're not going to become a good rehabber. Animals are going to suffer in your care because of your inability to do the right thing for them. And doing the right thing is really hard. I've worked with some animals for months, and I grew really attached to them, and I care about them. And the dawning realization sometimes of this animal is never going to get better again. It's not going to be able to survive in the wild like this. It's not going to be able to migrate. It's not going to be able to mate. It's not going to be able to find food. And it's not a good candidate for captivity because captivity is just going to stress it out. You have to be the one who's responsible in that moment. Put your feelings aside and go, the right thing to do here is for me to choose death for this animal. And that's really hard, to spend all of this time, this money, this effort. You've believed that this case could get better, and eventually you have to resign yourself to the fact that we're out of options. There's nothing that we can do. So while euthanasia is the big one that I think that you need to consider, you also have to think about how you think animals should be treated in general, but also how people should be treated too. And I find, especially if you're a young person, people often ask you when you think about what career you're going into, like, what are you interested in? And I think a better question is, what are your values? So for instance, I really love English and I really love history. And I thought about going into both of those fields professionally, but the thing that steered me away from it was I thought about what kind of jobs do people with English degrees get? What kind of jobs do historians get? Would I enjoy those? Would I not enjoy those? And eventually I realized, yeah, I like those things, but I like them as hobbies. I don't necessarily want to go into them. And that doesn't mean that I'm not interested in them or I don't care about them. It just means that for me and my traits, I think going into science was a better choice for me. And finally, you kind of have to think about what lifestyle you want too. As a rehabber, you're not going to make a lot of money probably. And it's a huge financial decision to go into rehab, especially if you're graduating with student debt. Like, that's kind of precarious. As a rehabber, especially early in your career, you're probably going to be working weekends. You're probably going to definitely be working at least some holidays. And maybe for you and your family, holidays are kind of sacred. They're a time for you and your family to get together, and not being able to have that for probably many years might be something that's a deal breaker for you. And here's the thing, that's okay. Listen, American culture is very work-driven. We're really taught to identify with our jobs, and that's a big thing for us. But you want to be full in all aspects of your life, not just your job. Because if you're only satisfied in your job, then what else is there? Even though I'm super passionate about nature and wildlife, I need a break from it sometimes too. So you really should start thinking about your whole life holistically and what kind of life that you want to have both inside work and outside work. And that means thinking about the things that you value. I always tell wildlife conservation students, you're probably going into this field because you care about animals and you want to make their lives better. And that's a really great and noble thing. We need people like that who care. But if you're going to be working with living organisms in any capacity, all living things die. All living things die, and you have to start thinking about what that means for you. And especially in American culture, people don't like to talk about or think about death, but I think it's one of the most important things that you should think about and develop a relationship with if you're going to be working with animals. And everyone's relationship with death is going to be different. Some people are going to have a religious or spiritual connection to it. Some people are going to have a more scientific relationship with it. And some people are going to have a mix of both of those things kind of combined in a weird hodgepodge that only makes sense to them. I personally think that everybody, even if they're not going into a wildlife or animal related field, should seriously think about death. And I don't mean that in kind of a depressive, sad way. The reason why I say this is because if you have a healthy relationship with death, it makes you value life so much more. I'm a little bit unique in that I was a teenager when I started doing wildlife rehab. That means that I saw things that I care for die while I was in high school. Some of those experiences, honestly, were extremely traumatizing. But I'm really glad that I had them because it made me understand life so much more by coming in such close contact with death. I think that all of us deep down know that life is really precious and we don't like to think about death, but I think by acknowledging death, especially your own death, makes you so much more happy to be alive. At least that's been my experience working in a field where you see a lot of death. Finally, on that note, for number 5, you need a backup plan. And you need to have a backup plan for a few reasons. Both because you might find out, yeah, rehab's not for me, especially as a long-term career. Or you find out it's something that you do really like, but it's not going to pay your bills. And this is where I think knowing what motivates you really matters. If you want to go into rehab, there's probably a couple different things that you could care about. So if what really matters to you is saving wildlife, preserving natural spaces, and keeping those wildlife populations healthy, you might want to go into wildlife biology, environmental advocacy, or land management jobs. Typically, these fields are a little bit more hands-off, but not necessarily. If it's really hands-on or at least close contact that you want to have with wild animals, maybe you should think about education, working still in rehab, but with education animals rather than patients. Most jobs at zoos are pretty hands-on as well, And also, let's not rule out lab jobs. I know that a lot of animal lovers balk at the idea of doing stuff with research animals, which is exactly why I went and got lab jobs so I would understand what it's like. And for some people who really just want to have hands-on contact with animals, sometimes that works for them. And when I say lab jobs, that encompasses a whole lot of things, including people whose job is to take research animals, mice, rats, rabbits, finches, all sorts of things that we use in biology, and they figure out how to make their lives better in captivity. If you're really interested in seeing wildlife, you should try looking into field jobs, photography, or even tourism jobs. Field biologists work with all sorts of animals. Wildlife photographers take beautiful shots that inspire us to care about nature. And ecotourism is an emerging field, and you could be that person that gets to show people animals in the wild and why they should care about them. That's conservation too. Or maybe what drew you to rehab is you kind of wanted a job that was kind of fun and comfortable. The idea of working with animals seemed fun and seemed like a pretty good gig. But maybe deep down what you care about is having the stability to be able to do something like that. Maybe it's not necessarily the job itself, but the idea of what the job represents. And maybe then the right path for you is not to go into a wildlife field, but to go into a field that makes you a lot of money, and then you can do rehabilitation on the side without the financial burden. And honestly, a lot of the wildlife rehabilitation field started this way. In my experience, the majority of old school wildlife rehabilitators were people who were pretty well off that had money and had time to do a hobby, and they chose to save animals. And personally, I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of if that's the route you go. Just make sure that you understand biology, wildlife biology, and some of veterinary medicine if you go that route. So hopefully that's some really good advice that'll help you land your first wildlife rehabilitation job and be happy in that job too. But what else should you know about rehabilitation before you go into it? Well, for that, watch this video next.